Hi, welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Mark Reich. Our guest today is Mark Reich. He is a senior lean coach with the Lean Enterprise Institute. Mark spent 23 years with Toyota, including 6 years in Japan, helping launch Lexus and later managing the Hoshin Kanri process in North America during a period of rapid growth. Then at the Toyota Supplier Support Center, or the TSSC, I think it's the Toyota Production System Support Center as that's evolved. He helped apply TPS in manufacturing, healthcare, and nonprofits. Since 2011, he's been a senior leader at the Lean Enterprise Institute, coaching executives and guiding lean transformations across multiple industries. And we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but you can see it behind Mark if you're watching the video. I've got a copy of the new book here published by LEI. It's titled Managing on Purpose, Using Hoshin Kanri to Develop Strategy, Align Teams, Grow Leaders, and Innovate Your Enterprise. So Mark, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great, Mark. Thank you for having me. Good to be on a podcast with someone with the same name.
Mark and Mark show. We almost crossed paths timeline-wise at LEI. I was kind of on my way out of former role there as you were joining, so we haven't had too many opportunities to cross paths. But I'm glad you're part of the LEI team there, and opportunity. And we'll have a chance to dig into this to help bring what you learned at Toyota to other organizations, as I know Toyota encourages, right?
Absolutely. I think that's part of one of the key organizations that you just mentioned that I worked with while I was with Toyota is TSSC. Mm-hmm. And TSSC's mission now is to work with a broader set of organizations across nonprofits, manufacturing, et cetera.
Yeah. And the either Toyota retirees or people who left to go on to other challenges, they've all emphasized how Toyota almost framed it as an obligation to go share what they've learned, which I appreciate, as opposed to a company wanting to keep everything secret and close to the vest.
Yeah, when I was first, I spent, like you had mentioned, my first 6 years working in Toyota in Japan, and then I had this opportunity to move from there to TSSC in the U.S. I really hadn't heard of TSSC, and when I learned about it, it was a little bit shocking to me that here's an organization that's made a decision to share their most precious know-how with anyone who is interested in learning about it, and not just like setting up and doing some classes, but actually helping companies practically make change.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
It is. So if I have a standard question, you talked about your beginning at Toyota. I'd like to learn more of that origin story of, how did you end up working at Toyota? What was kind of the background and the circumstances that led you to the company, and then in particular to Japan?
Sure. I think people, I've learned through the course of life, I'm pretty far into it. I think you both stumble on opportunities and make opportunities. So this was kind of a combination of the two. It was the 80s. The economy in the US was pretty bad. In the early 80s, coming out of college, Japanese economy was booming. I decided it might be interesting to go there and learn something. I went to university in Japan, in Nagoya, a school called Nanzan, to do some postgraduate studies. When I finished that program, I asked my professor, I decided I wanted to work and stay in Japan, work for a Japanese company. Are there companies that come to the university that I can? And he said, we don't have a formal recruiting program, but sometimes companies call us. So let me ask my secretary. So he rang her up. She said, we got a call from Toyota this morning. I made the opportunity, and then I went to Japan. I stumbled on the opportunity because I had no idea at the time that Toyota was probably the most respected company in Japan. Mm-hmm. And so, but I went through the series of interviews and ended up getting into Toyota there.
Now, did you? I don't know what your undergraduate degree or degrees were. Did you come to Japan with knowledge of the language, or was that part of the challenge to come and learn?
That was part of the challenge. Interestingly enough, and thank you for raising that. My undergraduate degree was, I I got a bachelor's in English writing.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't so useful in the general world, but
Yeah.
but it did. I just, with the publishing of this book, I now have filled a bucket list item that was been on my bucket list for 40 years.
Yeah.
But I don't know. To some extent, it shows the power of Toyota. They built me into an industrial engineer. So but I went to Japan with very little. I think I took a course. I was in San Francisco at the time. I think I took a course at Berkeley on like an introductory class to Japanese, but pretty much went in and hit the ground running.
Yeah. And you didn't do, it's a common path. Some of my friends from college went to Japan to teach English, which, coming in with no Japanese language, it's like, well, how do you teach a language you can't connect the two?
I had to put meals on the table. I did teach some English as I was going to school. Yeah. That often is not a full-time job, so I kind of got by while I was studying Japanese, and I got proficient enough that it helped me get the position at Toyota too.
Yeah. And so what was that role that you got hired into, or that function? Was it related to Japan and their story of becoming a more global company, expanding in the U.S.?
Yeah, it was quite related. I think the division I was hired into was called the Overseas Planning Division. Basically, we were the group responsible for kind of the intermediary function to define product specifications for future models, as well as pricing and supply. It's a pretty critical group, actually, working as in between the chief engineers and all the overseas markets. So if you can imagine, a chief engineer might have responsibility for like designing the new Corolla. And that Corolla sells in 75 markets around the world. But you can't make 75 versions of a Corolla. Right. That would be impossible to fit every market. Now, there's certain market specifications that are required, like environmental related issues. But part of our role then was to determine with key markets what would be those specifications for future models. Yeah, and it was really interesting work. It taught me the automotive industry because you had to know cars. The nature of our day-to-day work was defining specifications.
Yeah, and I think people listening probably know John Shook's story of coming over as an American, being I think the first American hired into Toyota in Japan. He, along with Jeff Leiker, wrote the foreword for the book. Did you meet John? Was he still over there? Or
I worked with John. Now, by the time I got there, I was working at our headquarters in Toyota City, where John had worked as well. But he had moved on he was working, I think, in public affairs in Tokyo, which is where Toyota at the time had its public affairs group. So he was, but we call them foreign national employees. That we were a fairly small group in Toyota, in a company of, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people. We were, I think, probably 50 of us. So everybody pretty much knew everybody. Yeah. And I interacted a bit with John while I was there.
Yeah. And you talked about, Toyota's known as being, a people development company, and you were saying that they, developed you into an industrial engineer. Were there roles to follow then in one of the plants, more directly related to production?
Well, one of the interesting things about joining Toyota, for not just me, but any team member in Japan that joined, before I even went to my office, I spent 3 months building cars.
Okay, they did have you do that. Yeah,
I think John did that too. I worked at the Sumi plant, which is the plant that it's kind of the mother sister facility to the Toyota Kentucky Georgetown plant, where we make Camrys. But and it was the middle of the bubble era in Japan, so sales were crazy. It was busy. It was hard work. But it's an incredible learning experience, because I do repeat that story a lot, because Toyota did that for a purpose, and that is people that went on to professional careers in whatever function you're in, an engineer, an accountant, I mean, they want you always to remember this is where the value is created for the customer, and
Yeah.
it's really hard work, and we work to support those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to respect that work.
Yes.
Pretty deeply.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Well, and even Asao Yoshino tells his stories about being hired in out of college. Within Japan, his first assignments were out in manufacturing. And he's got his, as Katie Anderson has helped him tell the story, and he also with Katie told it on My Favorite Mistake podcast. He learned early on, his story about I would say being involved in a mistake involving chemicals and a paint machine, and he feared he would be fired, and he realized that it was a very different reaction that was focused on systems and processes, and they almost apologized to him for kind of putting him in that position where the error was possible. Did you have? Is there a similar story like Mike Hoseas has one about scratching a car? Maybe you avoided mistakes.
Well, yeah. I mean, I can. I don't know if it's it's interesting because of course that's the nature. In fact, your book is right behind you, though, the mistakes we make. So
yeah.
It's how you frame what you call a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could call any andon pull a mistake. So I vividly remember my first andon pull when I was putting that on the line. We went in. I said the tack time was very fast. The assembly area I was put on. I said I worked in the assembly line. That's actually a little bit of a falsehood because I'm about 6'2", 190 centimeters. There's a height limitation on the assembly line at that time. Okay. Japanese have gotten bigger. Maybe they've changed this, but it was 180 centimeters. So I actually worked on I did front bumper assembly that fed the line directly. So I worked tack time. I worked next to a guy who they had pulled from a supplier. The bumper assembly was a one-man operation, but they had two of us on there, and it seemed like a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy next to me was doing 2/3 of the work, and then of course I missed. I made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
We had to pull the andon because the problem occurred, and the team leader came, and it was like I saw a miracle in front of my eyes. I mean, it was the most proficient assembler of a part I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. He caught us. I mean, we speak to you, and those familiar with the lean world and Toyota world, like the team leader's got to catch you up within cycle. Right. End of like that 60 seconds. I mean, he had no problem with that. And here we were struggling for two of us to do it in a minute together. And so I think it just kind of illustrated to me. Well, first of all, and when he came up and did all that, he coached us a little bit in that 20 seconds he had. There was never any admonishment. I mean, about that we did something wrong. So that is as you can see, that kind of like sticks in my memory as an important point.
Yeah.
As my start into
it. Yeah, and those stories are so consistent, which tells me, okay, there's some intent around that culture. It's not coincidence that people in different plants, different times, different countries, kind of get that response where, if you're new to it, I mean, there might be the fear that it would be a mistake to pull the cord because you might get chastised or punished or shamed in some way for not keeping up. In some workplaces, sadly, they might copy the andon cord mechanics and then treat people that way. They might say, that was a mistake to pull the cord. I'm going to really avoid doing that instead of feeling like it's a positive expectation to pull the cord, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was just by coincidence here, Mark. I was in the Georgetown plant last week. We at the LEI we do a joint twice a year. We do a learning tour with TSSC Toyota, and we visited the Georgetown plant. It is alive and well. I mean, I hadn't been in a Toyota plant since before the pandemic, and it was really nice to go back and see. Actually, probably more than ever. I saw two things that were amazing. One is the culture you're speaking to is alive and well. There's red everywhere, meaning red meaning things are behind. There's problems. People talk about them. It's very open. But at the same time, that plant has like changed significantly. So it's great to see that Toyota's like, I would say going through, and when I say change significantly, not just the layout, but like how stations are arranged, how they think about like the flow of the line.
Yeah.
Exchange. So it's exciting to see that evolution of the company.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a chance to go to Georgetown a couple of months back, and there's what you see, and then there's what you hear. You almost constantly hear the andon chimes and the music playing as you're coming through. And somebody might think, well, if they've been at continuous improvement for so many decades, how do they still have so many problems? But like, I mean, how do you react to, like, if somebody were to be a little amazed of like, oh, they don't have it all figured out yet, how do they still have andon cord pulls?
Hey, well, that's like a fundamental, like at the very basic understanding of the Toyota production system is that there's always going to be problems. Mm-hmm. I mean, the nature of that's one of the things that's interesting is the nature of the system. People sometimes forget is to recognize that problems are going to always happen. And so you're not you're not trying to build a perfect system. You're building a system knowing that you're going to encounter problems all the time.
And you might solve some problems, and because of new products, new parts, evolution of the product, different technologies, I mean, that creates new opportunities.
That's right.
New problems, right?
Well, I mean, a perfect example is people always think, well, the Toyota like system has no inventory. That's not true at all.
You see the inventory.
Designed inventory.
Right.
It's managed inventory. Because you're going to have problems, and you're going to, at some point, you're going to need some.
Yeah. So you left Japan after 6 years. Tell us about some of the steps. Because we're going to dive into the book here and Hoshin Kanri. Like what's the kind of the long story short of some of the progression of then getting to a role where you were really responsible for, or in a key, I don't know the exact language, so I'll just ask you, but a key Hoshin Kanri role for Toyota North America. I want to hear about that role, but I'm curious what other things you did to get to that point, job-wise.
Yeah, sure. So I transitioned back to the U.S. I became a manager at TSSC, the organization that was helping our suppliers, helped grow that organization. And then after I spent close to 7 years there, a lot of that's out in the field. But Mr. Oba, who was the head of TSSC then, came to me at this is like in 2000 and said, Mark, it's time to start thinking about the next steps of your career. And one of the options he laid out, which was kind of interesting to me, is that there's an opportunity in our corporate strategy group to lead our Hoshin. Now I was familiar. I had participated in Hoshin Kanri. Every department in Toyota does. As a participant, as a manager, I participated in that. But he said you may have an opportunity to lead that effort, and so I moved to our corporate strategy group in our headquarters. We had responsibility for managing Hoshin across the North American enterprise, and so that's where I really got kind of deep exposure to the process, and it helped because, and you mentioned this at the beginning, but it really helped because, or I would say, the depth of my understanding was facilitated by some of the struggles that existed in Toyota North America at the time. And I'm happy to expand on that. Would you like me to?
Yeah, please.
Sure. Yeah. So this is around 2001 too. Toyota really hit the accelerator around the decade of 98 to 2008. Toyota pretty much 2.5 times of growth of sales in the U.S., North America, but also in terms of like our production expansion. We went through we had like 3 disparate production factories, and that ballooned to like 12, including a couple component factories. And over the course of that decade, and all of that went from also a situation where we had been managed pretty much by Japan. The plants reported directly back to Japan. There was really no headquarters in North America managing all that. We established a headquarters, and but the plants still, to a great extent, relied on Japan for decision making and were siloed. So part of the I think the power of Hoshin that I learned, so I went into a situation in Toyota. Toyota wasn't so great. I mean, people always think about Toyota like this perfect company. There were a lot of struggles, the growth, the lack of unity, and Hoshin Kanri helped us a lot, because it's about a big portion of Hoshin Kanri is about building alignment to a direction across the organization. And we didn't have that among our senior leadership, like enough. I wouldn't say it didn't exist at all, but it wasn't enough in North America. And Hoshin Kanri is an excellent process to help us do that. So I got the chance over the course of that next 5 or 6 years to help contribute a lot to that purpose.
And so when you're in that role, are you helping facilitate catchball horizontally, vertically? Are you working with senior leaders to kind of help, at least with the articulation? I mean, it starts with strategy before we think about strategy deployment.
Right.
Go
ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, we realized that when you took a step back, part of this like silo of the plants and the leaders in those plants. I mean, a leader in a Toyota plant's a pretty big deal. I mean, that's like a 5,000 to 7,000 person facility. You're in charge of a small town.
Right.
So, but they were not unified in their thinking and what direction we should go. So one of the first things we did, going into my second year there, was we pulled all the top leaders from headquarters and the plants together to define. This was like 2002, 2003. To define a vision for 2010. Like, what do we want to achieve as an organization, kind of a more unified organization? And that was actually really helpful, because it helped us focus on some key, like, long-term initiatives. Like a big example being, for example, like supplier development. We were still in the early 2000s. Toyota is still fairly small in the U.S. and we didn't have a big portion of like the suppliers. Major suppliers were supplying the big 3. And so to be able to build better supplier relationships, develop better supplier capability was a key factor, and getting the plants aligned to all of that, because they shared common issues with suppliers, though they didn't work together on those common issues often. So that was a key thing.
Yeah. So let's step back a little bit. And again, we're joined Mark Reich. The book is Managing on Purpose. How do you define and connect, maybe kind of working backwards? You have Hoshin Kanri, you have Hoshin, you have the word strategy. How would you define those, to a fundamental definition?
Well, there's a definition in my book. Can I read it?
Please.
Yeah, I mean,
that helps make sure there's some standardization of what you wrote and what you're saying.
Right up front. I figured, after a couple iterations, I did get some feedback on this book. Maybe you should clarify those couple key terms, the ones you just asked. So in the book, Hoshin is like your fundamental direction or policy. And the word, the Japanese word, is kind of like, of course, Japanese is phonetic. It's kind of the arrow or the compass that points you in a direction. So that's your fundamental direction or policy.
Yeah.
Hoshin Kanri then, let me second talk about strategy.
Sure.
And I define strategy as specific decisions and determining actions that position an organization to achieve an overarching goal and competitive advantage. So that's pretty broad. and it looks at how, thinking about what considering the market and the environment and internal issues, what's the direction we want to go. Then Hoshin Kanri is meant to be a management system. It's a management system for strategy that defines the midterm and long-term direction, those objectives and targets, and annually builds alignment vertically and horizontally to the direction, manages the annual execution to the direction, and develops capability of people throughout the organization. I know that is a bit of a mouthful, but I'd like to explain that to people because that's what it was encompassed in Hoshin Kanri for Toyota, and I think that it embodies like what makes companies successful if they follow those kind of basic thinking.
Yeah, and if we want to wordsmith for a little bit, I hear sometimes people using the word Hoshin as shorthand for Hoshin Kanri, kind of like sometimes they say Kaizen when they mean Kaizen event. And like maybe something's a little bit lost in shortening or just using the one word instead of the two together.
Yeah, I think it's good to refer to what I just said, like what's your Hoshin could as an example could be like what do you think is the direction? Like your fundamental policy. Hoshin Kanri is meant to more embody like the management system because Kanri is kind of management. So how do you manage that direction?
Yeah, I've heard some people translate. You use the word compass. I've heard Hoshin Kanri translated. You could say it's management compass. Mm-hmm. But I've heard some people say our Hoshin process when I think they mean their Hoshin Kanri process. They're probably on the same page, but I get
just one note. I mean, companies ask. I was in a big organization the last couple of days, and they it's a Japanese word. And so they struggle. Are we really going to use Japanese word? And I'm comfortable with using any words. It is sometimes nice to, like if you're trying to get a framework of thinking of a new concept to take on new terminology for it. Mm-hmm. That can be helpful. I tend to squirm a little bit at the common English translation that's given as strategy deployment. Mm-hmm. Because it sounds a lot like there's some general on a hill that's like sending people into battle, and this is not meant to be a top-down only process. It's a top-down, bottom-up process.
Yeah, deployment or cascading that I think often it has the implication or the reality of being just that one top-down direction. Gravity does its thing. So maybe let me ask. How do you coach people, executives, through kind of changing that mindset to an expectation of whether we use the awkward phrase "catch ball" instead of playing catch? Like we can get together and catch ball sometimes, or there I go. We're digging in the words again. But the real question is kind of coaching leaders through to a point where they are at least open to the pushback, the catch ball, the back and forth, not having the magic answer that's being cascaded down.
It's interesting, Mark, that you asking that question kind of sparked my some thoughts that I haven't really thought deeply about, but it's actually not as difficult as I like having done this now in multiple organizations. Uh-huh. What I think. In many ways, leaders want to involve people in the organization more actively. They haven't had a mechanism to do that. So strategy tends to live up in this like upper tier group, and there's no way to and methodology to cascade it effectively. Uh-huh. So when we introduce Hoshin Kanri, I introduce a fairly structured approach where you can develop some high level objectives at the leadership level, but let's very quickly start to engage the people below that and get their input and see if those are really the right things. It's not just a cascade. Let's get some bottom up feedback, and that's usually the start of more concrete discussion around what are the things that has to be done at those different levels of the organization. And usually when you do that, it's pretty quick. Mm-hmm. People are like, hey, I appreciate like that I have a voice, and leadership usually appreciates that too, like that they're engaging people that way, and it pulls great thinking out of the organization, I think.
Yeah, because there's a difference, I think, between thinking of it as equally top down and bottom up versus, yeah, we say top down and bottom up, but mostly top down. But by exception, we take some input and change. Like there's probably degrees of that balance.
Oh, that's a really good, insightful question. Because ultimately, this is top management's job.
Yeah.
I mean, so this is not about like, let's go to like all 5,000 of our people and just ask their opinion on what we should do. I mean, there clearly needs to be some like insight and direction provided by leadership, but what's gained, and this is the whole like, and I know you talk about this in a lot too, is this whole Gemba concept. It's not just only about like this communication back and forth. It's an acknowledgement by leadership that I need to better understand the issues that exist in the front line in the work. And that's that is an important part of strategy too. It isn't just like, of course it's important what the market's doing, what your competition is doing, but it's also important internally, like what are the things that we're doing and where do we need improvement in the work that we do, and how can we like build more innovation from the bottom up of the organization to get people to think that way.
Yeah. So this is not the delegation of strategy. This is not the democratization of strategy, but it's getting sincere input around things like goals and breakthrough activities, and like do you tend to get more bottom up input then on kind of more of the strategy plan and execution as opposed to input on the strategy itself?
I think it's a bit of both, but I would also say there's another deeper dimension to that too, Mark, is that one of the things that's very valuable in all this is it's not just a communication mechanism, it's a role and responsibility defining mechanism. So when we define at the top level, and I try to get companies to focus on 3 to 5 objectives, like going forward, not 40 or 50. Sometimes that's true. But when we define those, you don't have 3 to 5 people at every level. They're going to need to accomplish those 3 to 5 things. You've got to like break down that content, and a higher level objective has to be broken down to like a department level objective. And once you start to do that, you're not only just engaging, like getting input from people, you're actually defining responsibilities for people to achieve those higher level objectives. So I think it actually builds huge amount of ownership for problems in the organization. And so then when people start to like do that, like work that way, they start to come up with new ideas for new things that should happen because they're owning problems as opposed to just being like cascade or given something to do.
Yeah, and hopefully that invitation to participate, to help break it down, to their level, also invites, if there's, the opportunity to speak up, to ask for clarification, or to speak up and maybe disagree with something, comes back to a phrase, psychological safety. This question of like, how safe do we feel speaking up? I was wondering if we could dig into that a little bit, whether it's around, shop floor andon cords, or, the catchball process that, Japanese companies, that seem in general have a reputation of being very hierarchical, being very seniority based. People are afraid to disturb the harmony by sticking out or speaking up. Maybe that phrase psychological safety wasn't being used directly, or, correct me if I'm wrong, or is it just more on the mindset of creating a culture and an environment where people do feel safe enough to speak up?
Well, I'll be honest, Mark, I can't speak for every Japanese company. I don't feel that Toyota had this mindset or culture of like that was very hierarchical.
Mhm.
I mean, and let me just give you explain the mechanism that's part of this, that's introduced in my book, is that you part of this what I talked about, this tiered, like the tiers of Hoshin Kanri, like you're creating a department level Hoshin and a company level Hoshin, but within the context of that, you have to actually solve problems. So it's very common for people in middle management level, frontline level, and this is introduced in my book actually a fair amount, is to use a mechanism. I know your audience might well be familiar with the A3 as a problem-solving mechanism. So A3 in Toyota is very much like self-driven. I mean, sometimes your manager will say, write an A3 on that. But that's also pretty much, I mean, that's often very just general direction. So you're the owner and investigator of the problem. But in many cases, you're like, it's of your own initiative that you take on and study the context of the problem. I think so, I talk about there's a lean post that I read a long time ago, talks about the skeleton and the muscle.
And this is on the LEI website.
The LEI website, yes. And the skeleton, Hoshin is like the skeleton in your body. It kind of it's the management system that holds the structure together. And that mechanism, problem solving, A3, is the muscle, and that's honestly where you build capability in the organization to be able to meet some of the objectives of that the organization set forth. So I think the dynamic, and I worked with, I know everybody, sometimes people can say, well, that's Toyota, but I've worked with I've been working and doing this in many industries now the last decade, and you can develop that culture in other industries. And I've done the construction industry, the healthcare industry. Yeah, I think, and it's a great mechanism for leaders to learn too, the A3 problem solving.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like as much it seems like there's in other organizations a lot of talk about, a lot of training at the lower levels of the organization on problem solving and PDCA mindsets. But is it fair to say the whole Hoshin Kanri process, and even more broadly the lean management process, works better when executives have the ability to practice and demonstrate those problem solving skills at the corporate problem solving level, the strategy problem solving level? I mean, you write in the book about short cycle and long cycle PDCA. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, you're kind of asking me two questions there. Let me ask.
I'm guilty of that sometimes. So
that's
sorry.
Okay. I can answer both.
break it
apart. First of all, one of the most valuable things that when I work with an organization, and we did this in Toyota too, but when I work with an organization and we try Hoshin Kanri just, in a way, it's that structure to build alignment, like what we've been talking about, and sets you up, but it doesn't, you have to execute on that. And when you execute on that, you're going to encounter problems. And then how the leaders behave in reaction to those problems is critical. And so one of the things I highly recommend and has helped organizations be successful is leaders need to do their own problem solving, and I would say, don't start at a big company problem, like we don't have enough revenue, or we need to get into a new market. Pick a very specific business problem down deep into the work, and what that drives, capability to understand those issues. So when you start your Hoshin process and you hit roadblocks, leaders then know how to go out and look and understand it and ask the right questions to investigate. If they never go through that problem solving themselves, they won't.
Yeah.
So, and then the second part of your question was, I'm sorry.
Then the second question within the question, and again, there's a bad habit of combining different questions. So the second question, I think, was about long cycle and short cycle PDCA?
Yeah. So, long cycle is, you can think about this across years, of course, if you're setting up a longer term plan or vision, but in the context of the book, we look at it kind of on an annual cycle. And you want to be reflecting on that. But I think for organizations, particularly those that are starting out with this, you need short cycle PDCA, which is once you get the plan determined, set up, I say during execution, you set up what we call an OBEA, like a visual room where you can see progress of that plan on a month-to-month basis. And the CEO and the team who's involved, the leadership team involved, and some of the key players that are executing on that need to come together and review where they are. And in that room, they need to see that there's where are we behind? And back to the andon pool you mentioned, that's the opportunity for the andon pool. If I'm red and I'm behind, why is it because I haven't progressed? Is it because I'm not getting collaboration? Is it because I need support from a higher level individual like the CEO? But that's the time. And so you need a culture in the organization that leadership allows that to happen. But the purpose of that is, it's everything is fairly fundamental in TPS or Toyota thinking is we want to know ahead or behind. And in a long cycle like that, it's hard to see ahead or behind.
Yeah.
So if we wait and many companies do this. I was actually in a review just the day before yesterday at a big organization where they're looking at the progress they made, and it's 9 months in. And so you want to know more frequently.
You can't adjust if you're already 9 months into the year and you're like, oh crap.
That's right.
And I don't have nearly as much experience with the Hoshin Kanri process, but it seems like one of the other new mindsets is not thinking in terms of just linear execution of the year's plan, but thinking in terms of those check-ins and in a non-bureaucratic way, not just going through the motions of we do all these reviews and but of actually checking and adjusting or studying and adjusting, which as different teams or departments are rolling up that check and adjust might involve redeployment of support resources, maybe kind of pulling back of okay, we're in the situation where we know this one team is going to stay behind, but we're prioritizing, we need to put more resources to get this other team from red to green because that's our choice. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. I would also say that part of that, there's a fairly detailed structure for the PDCA review that I put in the book around what I was just talking about, the short cycle. It talks about how do you plan for that review? How do you execute that review? And part of that is leadership. If that's all leadership is relying on, that's a problem.
Yeah.
It's just getting in a room and hearing some report about what's happened. When those red issues get raised, to your point about do we reprioritize or not, a critical part of that is the leader needs to go out and see. Why are we behind? And they need to be proactive about not proactive. They need to be positive about wanting to see for the point of understanding and support of the people that are doing the work. So if you can build that type of culture, it motivates people, but it also educates leaders and helps progress, I think. If you're only listening to a report in a room, you're relying on a couple of people to tell you what the reality is.
Right. And then let's say there's a situation where, let me ask first. I've heard a number of people say, and I'm curious your reaction to the statement, that it took our organization a couple of years to really kind of hit our stride with the rhythms of Hoshin Kanri. I see you nodding your head. Is that something you hear a lot or something that seems to occur?
That's
naturally.
Yeah, it occurs naturally. You're now. I want to qualify that because I'm working with just an example. I'm working with a software company in India right now, fairly decent sized company, and they've made significant strides. They're still in their first year, and they've tackled some really big problems because they've been able to organize and focus their effort on. They defined 6 objectives for the organization, which I think is a little. They're recognizing maybe it was a little too much, but still, it's more than they had before.
Right.
It's more focused than they had before.
Right. Fewer, objectives. Yeah.
And so, absolutely. I mean, I think I kind of lost my train of thought there.
No, but you're talking about making good progress in the first year. Yeah,
right. So you can make good progress in the first year, but you're kind of building. I mean, this Hoshin Kanri is a process. So you're kind of building the system and building the standards as you go through that first year. Mm-hmm. And I say it takes a good 2 to 3 years for it to kind of like be kind of stable in the organization. Because one cycle, it's like if think about it like watching a process in a hospital or watching a process in a production line. Mm-hmm. You can't watch it one time. You can't do it one time and think you got it right.
Right.
I mean, this happens to be a year-long process. So you got to go through a couple cycles because they're learning a whole lot of new behaviors and how to interact with each other and how to accomplish work in a different way.
Yeah, and there might be iterative improvement. You talked about that progression with the software company. I've seen and I've heard parallel stories from John Toussaint's experience in healthcare organizations where you come together and realize that somehow the organization has 300 top priority initiatives for the year.
Oh my God.
And they can reflect and say, well, why don't we make much progress? Because we have too many quote unquote top priority initiatives. And then the question is like, well, how many fewer is the right amount? Like, and there's a lot of debate and discussion for a lot of reasons where an organization might say the number is X, and then they might learn, okay, well, no, that number was still too big. And we learned from that. Or so that might be an example of longer cycle PDCA or an organization saying, oh, we always overestimate the IS department's ability to support X number of projects, and we end up partway through the year reprioritizing. Like, how do we do a better job of estimating and or getting the right level of resources in place at the beginning of the year? So it's not always this adjustment scramble. Those or some of the learnings and iterations.
What you're kind of talking about, I talk about in the final section of the book, or it's called Sustainability and Long-Term View. You've got to do what I call PDCA of the PDCA.
Yeah, right.
You're doing annual plan, do, check, act. But if you think about, there's a visual I show in the book that shows, Hoshin Kanri is a process. There are inputs, there's the process, there's the outputs, which you hope are like better products, better services, more capable people, and then you get business results out of that. That process has components like any other process, and and you just raised one example. But let's just say, your process of kind of defining the vision for the organization. How do you do that? How do you engage people? How do you know that the content that you're incorporating into that is good content? You need to reflect on those subcomponents too of the system. And I think that's I know that takes ramps it up a little bit, even more like. Challenging level for organizations, but that's how you build. I mean, that's how you build like improvement. And that requires you build a standard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and be able to improve the standard.
Right.
With all things. Yeah. There's so many things we could talk about, but maybe one other topic to dig into a little bit. There's probably a listener out there who might be thinking, you've been talking about this for over 45 minutes, and I haven't heard anything about an X matrix. Now, an X matrix is difficult to talk about in an audio format. And I haven't gone through the whole book yet, and I'm not advocating for the X matrix. I want this to be a kind of a neutral question of like I'm flipping through, and then I page 46. As you clarify for me. You will notice there is no X matrix tool in this workbook. And I found people so associate Hoshin Kanri with the X matrix. Tell us more of your thoughts and experience around that.
Well, it's like associating pull system with Kanban.
Mm.
I mean, it's one tool.
Ah.
So I think pull system has a lot of other dimensions.
Mhm.
Like how do you set up a store? How do you define customer demand? What's going to be your production rate? I mean, I think that that's a little bit of I would say, you're a fellow lean guy here, and I think we struggle in our world where and I'll say LAI has our organization is some of the biggest reflections of any organization of introducing tools to the community, perhaps without full understanding and purpose, and then they get somewhat like misused. And so I'm not. If you read that full page, I don't say that. I don't dismiss the X matrix.
You don't.
I do believe that though that it is. It's to your point. People. It's sometimes the first thing. Not always. Sometimes the first thing people jump to. I honestly, when I came out of it, is interesting. I think it's in the book, but when I had never seen one. And working for 7 years, managing this as a general manager of this process until I never saw it. And I came out, and the 2 weeks after I left Toyota, Jeff Liker called me and said, I'm writing a book about leadership with Gary Convis. We want to talk a little bit about Hoshin Kanri. I want to put you in the book, quote, what do you think about this X matrix? And I was like, what is that? And so I've learned since I've been out, and I think it probably can be a useful tool. Just say, as an advocate of what I put in the book, if you're trying, and this is somewhat meant to be a neutral statement, if you're trying to do what we're talking about, which is engage up and down the whole organization in this effort, simpler is better.
Sure.
So meaning, you don't want to have to it's hard enough to get this work done and to define what you have to do and to clarify your roles, much less figure out how to even read something. So simpler is better for people, I think. And I found some of the feedback I've gotten from organizations that have tried the X matrix, and I know there's a lot that use it, but some found it a little bit difficult to cascade in the organization and to kind of its complexity a little bit.
Yeah. And, I'm having memories here of 21 years ago. I was working at my last manufacturing company. The director of Lean Six Sigma, who was great, was former Danaher. So he was the first person who had ever showed me. Your eyes are kind of lighting up because you're like, oh, they use the X matrix.
Well, yeah, they were kind of
Yeah. And, it was the first time I'd seen one, and he's showing it to me, and I'm not quite sure, am I supposed to be moving my head around with the paper and the rotating and the dots? And, so I don't know, with, an engineer brain and engineer education, it was a lot to try to absorb. And, I've worked with others who were teaching and implementing Hoshin Kanri, or at least elements of it to get started, where, strategy A3s and other mechanisms for trying to build alignment, facilitate discussion, make decisions. In the book you talked about, and this could apply to all sorts of things in the realm of lean, like the tool and the template versus the mindsets and the practice.
Right.
Let's keep those clear.
One of the things that I have appreciated John Shook introduced to the Lean Enterprise Institute because of probably some of his own reflections, putting out, some of the literature we put out, is just that, start with the purpose and the business problem to solve. Let's start with that as the first question. And then think about, what do we need to change in process? How do we develop people, as opposed to what tool we should use.
Right. And your story about being asked about the X matrix and saying you've never seen one. I was in Japan with Katie Anderson's excellent study tour last November, and we had both Asao Yoshino with us, and there was another, a little bit younger retired career Toyota executive, and I'm blanking on his name, unfortunately. But maybe I shouldn't attribute this to anybody, but it could be everybody. So somebody in the room asked about the X matrix, and Mr. Yoshino said, no, actually, the other executive first said, I don't know what is the X matrix, and then Mr. Yoshino jumped in. Is like, oh, I've seen this at other companies, in his post Toyota travels. So they both had that experience of a full career at Toyota without seeing the X matrix. Which again, I'm not saying that to poo-poo the X matrix for people who find it useful, and it seems like you're taking a similar stance. Like if that works for you, great.
Yeah, I think the key is to not get sidetracked. I mean, I think there's you looked at my book. There's a whole lot to learn and to do to make this successful, but it can be really helpful for organizations. And let's focus on that.
Yeah. So I think that's great advice. So the book, let me get back to the front cover. I got tangled up on one of the tabs, which are helpful, but I got stuck. The book is Managing on Purpose, using Hoshin Kanri to develop strategy, align teams, grow leaders, and innovate your enterprise. So if you're stuck in your Hoshin Kanri journey, there's a lot to absorb, and I've not gotten through the entire book yet, admittedly, but this will be a project to keep going through that. And I mean that as a compliment, that there's a lot there, and I encourage people to check that out. Maybe as a final question, we talked about defining purpose and the business problem to solve. How do you see companies that you work with kind of articulate best that need to embrace Hoshin Kanri, as opposed to saying like, oh, I've heard a lot about this tool, we need to implement it? Like what's kind of the best or most common articulation of that business problem to solve?
And sorry, let me clarify your question. Are you asking what kind of business problem, or how does Hoshin Kanri kind of help them define that business problem?
How do you see people kind of best defining the business problem? Or, what to you, what's the best articulation around the purpose and the business problem that Hoshin Kanri does help solve? I could have said that a lot more clearly. So
That's okay.
Does that make more sense? Is that
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, well, I think it's it is a good question, because with any organization, including Toyota, I mean, one of the most common questions I was asked in my career in Toyota by any man throughout my entire career was, what problem are you trying to solve?
Yeah.
And I think to start by starting with that business problem, starting with that context and that kind of problem, I think you've got to look at how and think about what Hoshin Kanri can help you solve in terms of your organizational problem. So it's a little bit different from like the business problem, which might be growth, or it might be your current costs, or your people engagement, or whatever your business problem is. I mean, I'm working with a large healthcare organization right now, where honestly, it's a little bit unclear in the context of the work they do, like how they're defining their long-term direction and how that is cascading into the organization to connect to people's work. And it's getting kind of mixed up between what do we manage on a daily basis and what do we manage longer term. And people get confused then in the organization on like, is this strategic work? Is this daily work? And so I think Hoshin Kanri can help clarify for you that, and it requires that distinguishing between daily management. What do we run? How do we run the business, so to speak? And we need that. That's really, really important. Like, Toyota needs to make cars every day. If you're working in healthcare, you need to like process patients and get them, take care of them every day.
Right.
You also need to be thinking longer term. So about like where the direction is the organization going, and to some extent you need two systems that work a little bit symbiotically, but separately, to manage those two things. And what I see often in organizations is often they're kind of like combined, Hoshin Kanri can help clarify that for you and delineate those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, Mark. Congratulations on the release of the book. Mark Reich, the book again, Managing on Purpose. There'll be links in the show notes to the LEI website and more. And thank you for playing catchball with me, where
Great.
sometimes I ask a long, rambling question. Thank you for asking for clarification. I think that was an example of catchball. I could have made that a little more smooth, but thank you for doing that.
No, I appreciate that. Thanks. Great talking to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. And there's so much more we could explore from your experience inside Toyota and beyond. Hopefully we can do this again sometime.
I'd love to. Thanks.
Thanks.